Obviously, this is a statue of the world-famous composer Ludwig van Beethoven. But this is also a monument to the relationship between Beethoven and possibly his greatest fan, piano virtuoso Franz Liszt. Knowing about Liszt's efforts in getting this statue built, we can begin to imagine how important Beethoven was to him. It was around 1835 when a group of German artists came up with the idea for a memorial to Beethoven here in Bonn, his birthplace. Now, when Liszt heard that there wasn't actually enough money to build a statue, he immediately got to work, raising funds by playing charity concerts and even donating his own money. Thanks to him, this statue of his childhood hero came about. What strikes me most is that Beethoven wasn't all that famous at the time, which makes us wonder, why was Franz Liszt so much into Beethoven? Our story begins when Franz Liszt was a little child. His father, Adam Liszt, was a violinist who played under the baton of Beethoven himself. Many times he told his son about the great impression that Beethoven made on him. And whenever the little boy was asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he would point at a portrait hanging on the wall, a portrait of Beethoven, and he would say, like him. But despite this childlike admiration of the great composer, the little Franz met his hero only once. And it happened here in Vienna. Just like Beethoven, Franz Liszt went to Vienna for his musical education. Of course they went to Vienna, because this was the capital of music. This was the musical epicenter, this was the place to be. Vienna was a city that loved music, and especially the piano. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were approximately 6,000 pianists in Vienna. And there must have been around 300 professional piano teachers. And Franz Liszt got to study with probably the most famous piano teacher of that time, Karl Czerny. Karl Czerny himself, he used to study with Beethoven. So here is a student of Beethoven that becomes the teacher of Franz Liszt. And this is 1822. Beethoven was still alive, he was in his 50s, he was deaf, he was struggling with his health, but he was still living and working in Vienna. He was still composing, and he was around, and I picture Franz Liszt must have been really eager to meet his big hero. You know, he was in Vienna, Beethoven was in Vienna, but did the two of them meet? We don't know. We don't know for sure, but according to Franz Liszt, it did happen, and it happened not too far from here. Here is a restaurant called Ludwig van. And that is no coincidence, because this is the street where Beethoven lived in 1822. On the first floor of this house, that was the place where Franz Liszt, if we must believe his story, did meet Ludwig van Beethoven. According to Franz Liszt, it was thanks to Karl Czerny that he actually got to meet Beethoven. Because Beethoven wasn't too keen on meeting him, he didn't really care for these musical prodigies. But Karl Czerny, he insisted. He told his friend and former teacher Ludwig van Beethoven, you must hear him play. After a while, Beethoven said, all right, bring me the boy. The next morning, 10 a.m., Karl Czerny took the young Franz Liszt up to Beethoven's apartment. Franz must have been really shy and a bit nervous, but Beethoven pointed him to the piano, and Franz Liszt played for Beethoven. After a while, Beethoven said, okay, now for something completely different. Can you play me a fugue by Johann Sebastian Bach? No problem, said Liszt. And he played for him a piece from Das Wohltemperierte Klavier. When he was done, Beethoven smiled. He gave him a stroke over his hair. And Franz Liszt must have felt encouraged. He felt brave enough to ask, may I play one of your pieces? And right there on the first floor, Franz Liszt performed a movement of Beethoven's piano concerto. And when he was done, Beethoven got up out of his chair, took the boy in both his hands and kissed his forehead. And he said, "You are a fortunate one, because you will bring joy and happiness to mankind." This is the famous story of the Vaiakus, the Kiss of Consecration, that Franz Liszt, in his own words, did get from his great hero, his idol, Ludwig van Beethoven. I doubt if it did actually happen, but it's a good story. We're at the office of the famous Beethoven Festival in Bonn because we have an appointment with the director of the festival, Nike Wagner. And I'm quite excited to meet her, also because her last name, Wagner, is no coincidence. She's actually related to both Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner. Nice to meet you. So good to be here. Yeah. Next to Beethoven. Feels very comfortable. But let's start with Franz Liszt. Now, a little bird told me that you are actually related to Franz Liszt. Is that true?
I'm his great-great-granddaughter, which may be deceiving because Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner were almost the same age. But since Richard Wagner married the daughter of Franz Liszt, there's this kind of shifting of generations.
Right, and her name was Cosima Wagner?
Cosima Wagner. She was the daughter of Franz Liszt and married his best friend.
Talking about Franz Liszt, what would you say is his legacy?
Liszt is an outstanding figure. It's easy, everybody knows his fame as a pianist. He is also famous for his social engagement for poor musicians. He is famous as a teacher. He taught lots of students and he could promote his style of playing this way. He was a conductor. He is not acknowledged enough as a composer, but he is an outstanding composer as well. And this was not easy at the time because he was the generation after Beethoven. And the composers were kind of, they had to bear lots of difficulties how to continue, how to write symphonies after Beethoven. And I think he found a way to do it.
Can you take us back to the year 1845?
Yes, 1845, 75th birthday of Beethoven, and his native town didn't really care. So Franz Liszt stood up and encouraged them and inflamed them to have a big celebration. So, of course, the argument is always, we have no money. So he played to raise money, benefice concertos, recitals, and then he collected money until the statue of Beethoven could be completed. And then they didn't have any hall to play Beethoven symphonies or chamber music. So Franz Liszt, went around and almost forced the citizens of Bonn to build up in 11 days a big concert hall made of wood for 2,000 persons. Then he started inviting the royalties, England, collecting a representative public. So he was like an impresario who put up the whole big celebration of this birthday of Beethoven.
Franz Liszt was a very active man, helping colleagues, raising funds for charity. Was Beethoven not just one of his many projects?
No, he was occupied with Beethoven, one could say, through his lifetime. And especially in all functions you can possibly imagine. As a pianist, as a conductor, as an editor, as an organization, as a promoter, as a teacher, and I would say also as a composer.
Behind me is one of the cultural capitals of Europe, a city with a recorded history going back more than 2,000 years. And I can certainly see why the Hungarian-born Franz Liszt was drawn to this place. Behind me is the city of Rome, and over there on the next hill is where we are headed. In the 19th century, this place was still a bit outside of Rome. Just to give you an idea, 800 meters in that direction is the Vatican. And over there, Franz Liszt lived from 1863 to 1868 in the monastery Madonna del Rosario. This was a difficult time for Franz Liszt. The years before, he had lost both his son Daniel and his daughter Blandine. And around the same time, one of his lifelong rivals, Johannes Brahms, published a manifesto against Liszt and the modern composers in what was to become known as the War of the Romantics. And on top of this all, trouble in the love department. Franz Liszt had fallen in love with Caroline zu Sein-Wittgenstein. The two were about to marry here in Rome. But unfortunately, Caroline was officially still married to a Russian prince. And on the eve of her marriage with Liszt, the prince managed to squash permission for that marriage at the Vatican. And Liszt was devastated. Discouraged by this all, he decided to enter the monastery. To live a more solitary life, he moved into a small and basic room in that 18th century monastery, Madonna del Rosario. Let's see if we can get a bit closer. As we can see, they're still taking good care of this place. There's actually some renovation going on. But why was this place so important to our story? Well, it was right here that Franz Liszt finished the monumental task of transcribing all 9 Beethoven symphonies for piano solo. More than 20 years earlier, in 1837, Liszt had already transcribed some of the Beethoven symphonies, and for sure, him playing these piano versions during his concerts contributed to their fame. But he had put aside the work, and for years and years, his publishing house, Breitkopf und Härtel, had begged him to finish the complete set of symphonies. And now, right here, finally the time had come. Liszt did a magnificent job. And of course, I am not a pianist, so we've put someone behind the piano who actually is.
Hi, I'm a pianist, and therefore I will say some pianistic-y things about the Beethoven symphonies transcribed by Liszt. I think if someone was going to transcribe the Beethoven symphonies for piano, there couldn't possibly be any more perfect human being throughout history than Liszt. Mostly because the challenges that are faced when you're trying to do something like this, the responsibility for some resemblance to the actual orchestral score, are met with someone who has such incredible respect for Beethoven. The greatest works ever written, ever, for any medium, the Beethoven symphonies, he struggled immensely with it, but they're sort of absolute genius transcriptions.
So this must have been the room where he spent these years. And although it probably was a very small room, but my God, they gave him a room with a view.
Liszt wanted to transcribe these symphonies first and foremost because, they didn't have recordings, and the audiences at the time, the only way they would be able to get to know this music was to go to an orchestral performance of it, which wouldn't happen very often. So in the sense of what Liszt is doing by bringing this more to the general public so they can play it at home on their pianos is great. In practice, however, I don't think it would have worked so well because these are some of the most technically difficult pieces I've ever encountered in my entire life. And there's no way that an amateur pianist would have been able to do it. So I don't really know what he was thinking. Actually, I probably do know what he was thinking. He was thinking that he couldn't get away with doing anything less than the limits of what is humanly possible at the piano to convey this orchestral music because he had such respect for it and for Beethoven. It wasn't within his capabilities as a composer to simplify it.
We haven't been able to get in touch with the current inhabitants, so let's just ring the bell and see what happens. Oh, buongiorno. Do you speak English? No? Posso entrare? Va bene, va bene.
What you end up with is an incredibly authentic, sort of genius translation of the orchestral music with sort of never before seen revolutionary pianistic techniques used and all sorts of things. So they're pretty great.
We talked to a very kind and old lovely lady, one of the nuns, and we had to do so through a tiny window with little bars. And she was very, very sorry, but no one was allowed inside the monastery, and no, impossible to see the room of Liszt where he did this important work. But the good news, we did receive her blessings. Why was Beethoven so dear to him?
The easy answer would be by the quality of his music, of his composition. But I'm sure Beethoven was the god of the epoch. And Liszt, what he wrote in the preface to his transcription of the Fifth Symphony was, the name of Beethoven is holy in music. Liszt also made himself an advocate of the late pieces, played 3 of the 5 late piano sonatas in Vienna, one after the other. Il faut le faire, you have to do it. Yeah. And I think the whole revolutionary spirit that always is Beethoven never lost, and his innovativeness as a composer were close to the mind and the spirit of Franz Liszt. Only Franz Liszt was luckier with women, of course.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was much luckier.
Would you think Beethoven would be as famous as he is nowadays if Franz Liszt was never there?
Well, let's say Franz Liszt accelerated the process, by engaging himself. He was busy his life playing, conducting Beethoven. He was his god and he served this god.
Liszt was a major promoter of Beethoven's piano sonatas. Now, by that time, Beethoven's piano music was seldomly played, and the Hammerklavier sonata, very demanding work, was even considered to be unplayable. The audience thought Beethoven's music was a bit difficult, somewhat unpleasing, but Liszt, by frequently performing his piano works, gradually shifted the public perception of Beethoven's music. There's a beautiful recollection by a friend of Liszt who had dinner together with the composer at Wagner's Villa Wahnfried. He tells us the following. Liszt spoke especially of the famous Hammerklavier, and more particularly of the fine adagio in F-sharp minor which it contains. In the midst of a sentence, he stood up and exclaimed, "I will prove it to you." We retired to the music room. In the middle of the hall stood a huge piano, at which Liszt sat down and filled our souls with the mysticism of Beethoven's last works. Liszt seemed once more to have surpassed himself, to have established an inexplicable direct contact with a dead genius whose interpretation for him was a religious task. When the last bars of the mysterious work had died away, we stood silent and motionless. Suddenly, from the gallery on the first floor, there came a tremendous uproar, and Richard Wagner, in his nightshirt, came thundering rather than running down the stairs. He flung his arms round Liszt's neck and, sobbing with emotion, thanked him in broken phrases for the wonderful gift he had received. Once more, I witnessed the meeting of those 3. Beethoven, the great deceased master, and the 2 best qualified of all living men to guard his tradition. Being the director of the Beethoven Festival and having Beethoven sitting next to you, but also being a relative of Franz Liszt, which of the 2 is closest to your heart?
What a terrible question.
I'm so sorry.
What a terrible question. As if you were asked to whom you prefer from 2 of your children. So there's no preference in the exact sense. I think musical history also decided Beethoven has not been surpassed by the composer Franz Liszt. I think this we can state for sure. But Franz Liszt has worked in the revolutionary spirit of Beethoven by being innovative, musically, socially, morally, politically all the time. So there's a distinct legacy from Beethoven to Franz Liszt. But Franz Liszt is a very romantic spirit. Beethoven opened up to romantic spirit, but he had to develop him from the classical patterns into the more free romantic language. And in this sense, you can say Franz Liszt also continued where Beethoven started, but in his own spirit, and his spirit was a very poetic one. He always thought of literature, thought of poets, and he had a very French spirit. Beethoven had, I don't know if you can put it like this, for us, a very German spirit, somehow. Somehow. I love the two.
Franz Liszt and Ludwig van Beethoven, they only met once, but they were of vital importance to each other. Not only was Liszt hugely inspired by Beethoven, his childhood hero, but just as important was the influence of Liszt on Beethoven. I seriously doubted whether Beethoven would have been as successful nowadays without the help of Franz Liszt. So I'm sure that if Beethoven and Liszt would meet each other again in the afterlife, that Beethoven would give Liszt another big kiss on the forehead. But that's a story for another time and place.